Hello and welcome. And welcome back if you attended our first webinar in July on the modal difference between the natural and synthetic. We're glad to have you back, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the second panel dialogue of the 5-part series titled Unsettled Ethical Issues in Gene Drive Research. My name is Rafiq Ilyas, and I'm the Program Manager at McMaster University's Institute on Ethics and Policy for Innovation, also known as IAPI. This series, produced through the Gene Drive Research Forum, is the product of a collaboration between IAPI and the FNIH Gene Convene Global Collaborative. Through this panel discussion series, we intend to explore burning ethical concerns related to research, testing, and implementation of gene drive technologies for application to improve public health, to preserve biodiversity, and to address food security concerns. So before I introduce to this session, I'd just like to mention that if you're unable to stay with us for the entire duration, this and the previous sessions are publicly available and can be viewed on the Gene Convene YouTube channel. So in this second session, we will discuss, do justice and equity concerns bolster or hinder the case for the use of gene drive applications? This session is moderated by Dr. Sam Weiss-Evans, who is a senior research fellow with the Program on Science, Technology, and Society at Harvard University. Dr. Evans' research is focused on the governance of security concerns within synthetic biology. Pertaining to the gene drive technologies, Dr. Evans studies institutional transformation to enable stronger feedback loops between the communities that are engaged and the research that is being conducted. He has helped with training gene drive researchers at MIT and IGEM through advising project design for research in Massachusetts, New Zealand, and the Virgin Islands. Dr. Evans is also advising on institutional transformation as part of the DARPA advisory panel for the Safe Genes program. And with that, Dr. Evans, I'll pass the session on to you.
Thanks very much, Rafiq, and thanks to the FNIH and McMaster for pulling this fantastic panel together. I'll ask the panelists to turn on their video feeds now while I give a little introduction to the session, and then I can introduce the panelists and we can go from there. So our session is centered around a question that we were given, which is, do justice and equity concerns bolster or hinder the case for the use of gene drive applications? And I think first, in starting off this conversation, it's productive that such a question can even be asked in life science research and research generally, and at this stage of gene drive research in particular, where applications are being designed right now. Systems are being brought into play to understand which applications are desirable and which are not, and how they should be overseen and the like. But what does it mean to ask this kind of question? First off, we're asking it in this space right here, the Gene Drive Forum, which is part of the Gene Convene collaborative. And this Gene Drive Forum is a bit of an unusual space. So for those of you who might be new to gene drive research or new to this webinar series or to the Gene Drive Forum generally, a little bit of background I think is useful here, because this research forum came about in part in the early days of gene drive research, when the National Academies produced a report called Gene Drives on the Horizon. And part of that report really emphasized justice and equity issues, stakeholder engagement, and an attention to these parts of gene drive research and research generally that may have received less attention in previous research areas and other areas of research. And after that report, a set of supporters and sponsors of gene drives research got together and produced a publication where they outlined a set of guiding principles that said that they would commit to them. And one of those principles was a commitment to include resources needed to permit robust, inclusive, and culturally appropriate engagement to ensure that the perspectives of those most affected are taken into account in the processes of gene drive research. This forum is a manifestation of that commitment, the fact that we're gathered here today to have these conversations. And so in that sense, it is putting into practice a desire for this kind of inclusionary, I can't think of the right word to say that word, but these practices of inclusion. That said, this is a forum for conversation, for discussion. It's not necessarily a forum for action. And as you'll see, I think several of the panelists that we have on today will be talking about this disconnect and still the steps that are needed to take these commitments and take these conversations and turn them into meaningful on the ground engagement, interaction, and on the ground can mean in various communities, but it can also mean in various policy arenas, from the local all the way up to the international level, from early stage research to deployment and revision of deployments. And at all of those levels, at all of those stages, there's a need, I think, to rethink the ways that we work in order to have meaningful attention to issues like justice and equity concerns. And so I hope that each of our panelists will be able to provide their thoughts on that. Okay, so if we take our initial question and then turn it slightly around, we get, going from do justice and equity concerns bolster or hinder the case for gene drive applications? For me, I like to turn this question into one that's somewhat more about what does it mean in practice for justice and equity concerns to be guiding research trajectories? And I look forward to how our panelists might also reflect on how this question might be asked differently. Because if we take the justice and equity concerns seriously, that might alter the research and development trajectories that we pursue and don't pursue for gene drives. We have a great panel today. I'll introduce each of them briefly now, and then have each of them give their initial remarks. And then what we'll do is we'll have a back and forth with the panel, and then open it up to conversation from all of those involved. While the panel conversation will go on largely for about an hour after our initial remarks, I feel free to ask questions at any point using the chat feature in Zoom, and we'll incorporate your questions into the conversation as we can, or when we open it up to full Q&A. Our first panelist that we'll hear from is Carla Saenz. She's the Regional Bioethics Advisor for the Pan American Health Organization, which is part of, but also fairly, as I understand it, fairly independent of the World Health Organization's Regional Office of the Americas. She's responsible for the Pan American Health Organization's Regional Program of Bioethics, which provides support on bioethics to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and has been responsible for the development of this organization's ethics guidance for Zika and COVID-19. She's an elected fellow of the Hastings Center and has authored several publications on different areas of bioethics, co-edited the book Public Health Ethics Cases Spanning the Globe, and contributed to several ethics guidance documents. Our second panelist, Carolyn Neuhaus, is a research scholar at the Hastings Center. She's currently engaged in 2 research projects there on humans and nature and science and the self. Overall, she explores philosophical and ethical questions that arise throughout biomedical research and medical practice, from the philosophical foundations of the use of animals in biomedical research to the development of digital medicine and the use of AI in healthcare. Carolyn's a member of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, the International Neuroethics Society, American Philosophical Association, and the New York Society for Women in Philosophy. Next, we'll hear from Fred Gould. Fred co-directs the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. He researches the application of evolutionary biology and population genetics to enable sustainable use of insect-resistant crops and genetically engineered agricultural pests, and researches strategies for the development and use of engineered mosquitoes to decrease human disease. Fred's contributed to a range of mathematical models to assess current gene drive systems and has helped to conceptualize novel mechanisms for gene drives. He's a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, and he served on National Academy committees studying the environmental and health effects of the commercialization of genetically engineered crops. Our final panelist is Anna Maria Hubert, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. Anna Maria research's interests generally lie at the field of public international law, focusing on law of the sea, international environmental law, and international law and policy relating to science and emerging technologies. In connection with her research, she has acted as a consultant and provided information and advice to governments, treaty bodies, and intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, and scientific institutions. And she serves as an advisor to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carla for some initial thoughts to get us going, and then I look forward to hearing from the rest of us too. Carla.
Thank you, Max, and thank you to the organizers of the foundation of NIH and McMaster University. It's great to be having this conversation with you today. I want to start by reminding ourselves that the situation of the world, even forgetting, just the baseline situation of the world in terms of equity is of inequity. We live in a world that is extremely inequitable, that has a lot of inequity. And vector-borne diseases affect primarily the poorer countries. So they're not like high blood pressure. Thousands of people are dying from vector-borne diseases, primarily in those poorer countries. And just only in 2016, there was about 500,000 deaths only from malaria. So we have the moral duty to address this huge health disparity. And it's not just health, it's also poverty. It's not just the vector-borne disease causes deaths and disease. It also causes it causes poverty, and billions are lost due to vector-borne diseases. So to the extent that gene drive is an intervention that has the potential to reduce vector-borne diseases that put us in this massive inequity, it is an intervention that can contribute to reducing existing inequities. It can advance equity, not just at the global level, but also within countries. So that there are mosquitoes carrying disease in certain parts of the world, it's a brute fact, it's a fact of nature. But what is just or unjust is what we do in response to that. So I think we have the duty to at least explore what this intervention can do in terms of addressing this, the existing inequity and bringing more justice to the world. The questions that Max was saying, we will unpack the general question. So the question that we all ask ourselves is like, is gene drive actually effective in reducing vector-borne disease? Is it actually capable of improving health and reducing existing health inequities? Is it better than current strategies? It's actually the proper question, because it's not that we're not doing anything to address vector-borne disease. But the other question from the perspective of equity that really worries people in low and middle income countries is whether gene drive can exacerbate existing inequities. That is not just that it can fail to have the intended positive effect, but whether it can have a negative effect. What are the unintended consequences that could have, that could make the situation of affected countries and affected population even worse off? So I'm going to be, I work with Latin America and the Caribbean, and what I'll be sharing with you are some particular worries from the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean for this discussion. So the unintended consequences that people worry most about, and I don't think this is particularly different from other areas of the world, is ecological damage that is also seen as entailing economic damage too. Of course, other health negative consequences, new, worse variants of vector-borne diseases, but also there's a worry about the moral wrong that would be incurred, even if the health of LMICs is protected and is improved, but that would be caused because important decisions that impact you, your life, your livelihood, and your cultural identity are being made without including you in the decision-making process. So even what I want to say that because of this, from an equity perspective, an ethically sound decision-making process is key. There are challenges that are very important that we are aware of, because I think for each set of challenges, we're capable of coming up with a list of actions that could mitigate those challenges. And I mean, we all talk about the importance of involving affected communities. Public engagement is key for gene drive research. But I think we have to keep in mind that this is not a neutral topic. We are talking a lot about public engagement in all sorts of topics pertaining to COVID, for example. But there are, for gene drive, there are specific issues. And one of them is that instead of we're talking about having a conversation, just an open conversation about X, the situation is that X has already been presented as intrinsically morally wrong. So we're going here uphill, and to have a meaningful conversation, we need to provide in clear terms, transparent, meaningful information to communities so they can actually engage in this discussion. The previous session of this series was on a key topic, the discussion about what is natural and what does that entail from a moral perspective. That is I think I'm not going to go back. It's a great topic. I'm not going to go back to that. You had an entire session on this. But I think that one thing that we have to keep in mind is that we ought to do better in terms of advancing a more rigorous, a more adequate ethics analysis about what is it, about how what is natural relates to what's morally right. And we don't go around saying that the malaria is good because it's natural. So I think we need to start having this discussion, but in a way that also relates to the communities that we want to engage. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I'm a philosopher, and we can have a philosophical conversation about this that may not be really useful or relevant for the majority of people. We need to start relating. That's a way also to address equity. Not all of us have been lucky to have so much information, so much knowledge, and we have to close those equity gaps also by providing information that allows everybody that's involved to engage meaningfully in this discussion. And relating to people's experiences too. I'm from Peru. The Inca Empire, as you probably know, it's from Peru, and I grew up being told how proud we should be as Peruvians that the Incas were so wise that they could genetically manipulate potatoes and corn to make them more productive, less susceptible of disease. And it really surprises me that when we have a conversation about gene drive or any sort of genetic manipulation, there's never an attempt to relate to what this has meant for lots of people like me and for our own history and what we're proud of. And but I think that an important issue to keep in mind too is that the general topic of genetic manipulation of nature is, for the majority of people in LMICs, associated to injustice, to being taken advantage of. So there's this baseline mistrust that is also fueled by the fact that gene drive is perceived as some technology that's coming from the north. And while it should be easy to explain that we cannot do field trials with mosquitoes in Scotland, I think that we have to also understand that there's this vast disparity in research capacities that is also an equity issue that we ought to address. Another important challenge that is going to be crucial is in terms of like our capacities. What I would say is like our limited capacities now to engage meaningfully in an adequate, rigorous, and transparent risk assessment. When you're not familiar with something, new things come across as overly risky, and the broad scope of risks, the potential irreversibility of some of the harms that could take place. It's something that is, I don't think the majority of LMICs have much experience conducting those assessments, and there's a potential for the slippery slope approach. And also because we, for the most, lack the appropriate biosafety structure, we would really depend, we have to trust others to do what's needed to minimize risk or to mitigate possible harms. And which brings me to another challenge in terms of like governance, research governance specifically, that relates to the risk assessment. We have huge improvements in research governance in certainly Latin America and Caribbean, but I would say mostly all over the world in the last 10 years. But those improvements have focused on research with human subjects. And we're talking about gene drive, and while gene drive, yes, you may have a very little research with human subject component, but for the most, we're talking about research that impacts people, impacts their livelihood, impacts their environment, but it's not technically research with human subjects. So we need to go from what we know, from the governance that we are, that we have. That's not perfect, but it's a lot better. It's, I would say, for the most acceptable, to establish governance for a new area. And that's also that's an important challenge that, as I said, is related to the risk issue, because I think we in LMICs in Latin America and the Caribbean are doing a lot better now in terms of assessing the risks of research with human subjects. But there's still a knowledge and experience gap, as much as there's a governance gap addressing this other broader research of a different risk of a different nature. As I said, we've learned, I think we've learned, and we are learning a lot about engagement, public engagement during COVID, but there's still a long way to go. But overall, my assessment, my final words is that I think that gene drive has an enormous potential to address our baseline inequity because vector-borne diseases affect the poorest country. And we just have to do all these things that are needed that will also bring equity on their own, on top of the equity that gene drive has the potential to advance.
So thank you for those thoughts, Carla. I think it's really important for us to start off with your perspective, because I think it really can help productively ground the whole conversation. I'm going to turn it directly over to Carolyn here. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Thanks, Sam. And wow, thanks, Carla. There's already like a lot in what you said that I could respond to. So you put a lot on the table for us. But actually, in light of the kinds of different conceptions of justice and things that you brought up in your remarks, I think the work that I was going to do will be really helpful. So my own philosophical training centered on conceptual analysis, which is essentially, a close analysis of what the words that we use really mean and what does that imply about the world and those who live in it. And so, the question that's before us has two pretty loaded ethical concepts baked right in: justice and equity. And these take on different meanings in different contexts. And so to understand them fully, we have to really grapple with that diversity. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes here at the outset to just sort of lay out some basic definitions and distinctions within these concepts to kind of ground our discussion. And actually, a lot of the examples that Carla put on the table are super relevant to that. So I'll start with justice. And I think at its core, arguably justice is really about what is due to each person. And here I'm already saying that sort of in scare quotes, because there's a debate about the applicability of justice to non-humans as well. So, whether or not considerations of justice apply to animals or, even more broadly to all of nature. So I think that's an important thing to put on the table in this discussion, because when we're talking about justice in the gene drive space, we might wonder whether that includes justice for endangered species or invasive species and other non-human organisms that are affected by or can be said to have some sort of interest in gene drives. So I'm going to sort of park that, but I do think it's something that is on the table for today. If we stick to sort of person language, I just want to run through 4 different conceptions of justice that I think are relevant here. The first is substantive justice. So a notion of substantive justice is focused on outcomes. So it asks, I think, in an ideally just world, what does each person have? What does each person do by virtue of their personhood? And human rights are often justified on these grounds: rights to education, to health or healthcare, the right to make decisions about oneself, the right to love or to marry whoever one chooses. I think in the gene drive space, we might think or argue that a commitment to substantive justice means preventing preventable morbidity and mortality. We already heard Carla give a version of this in her opening remarks. For example, deaths from malaria are unjust in the sense that they rob people, especially children all over the world, of something they are due, a future or a life. So we might say that we have a commitment from a substantive conception of justice to reduce morbidity and mortality that's preventable. A second sense of justice is focused less on the outcomes, sort of the world that we'd like to bring about, and more on the procedures. So a commitment to procedural justice would ask something like, what does a just process for making decisions about gene drives look like? So how much say does a person or a community or a nation, how much say are they due? And maybe even how much sway are they due in decisions that affect them, or even in decisions that don't affect them. So, this depends a lot on the decision and the stakes of the decision. But in the gene drive space, a commitment to procedural justice, might be taken to mean designing decision-making procedures that give people, the amount that they are due, the amount of sway or say that they are due in the process. So I think this is kind of what we're getting at when we talk about community, stakeholder, and public engagement. Those are mostly about procedural justice. What are people due in the decision-making process? And Carla also flagged this, in the sort of on the global scale, the relationship between lower and middle income countries and higher income countries. Sort of who has the power in the decision-making process is a concern among the lower and middle income countries. That's really a concern about procedural justice. Will I have a say in how this technology is developed? Now, there's a really interesting sort of theoretical relationship between this idea of procedural and substantive justice. And some people think that if you sort of design the procedure right, then a just outcome is nearly assured or guaranteed. I actually don't think that's the case. I think we can design the procedure right and sort of create the optimal decision-making procedure, and we might end up with a somewhat unjust or otherwise like suboptimal outcome. So I think, this trade-off between substantive and procedural justice is one that is often is a matter of some debate, and another one that needs to sort of be made more obvious in this space. Okay, so that's substantive and procedural. Very quickly, distributive justice and then a notion of reparative justice. So distributive justice here refers to the guiding schema or principles that are used to distribute goods, benefits, or as the case may be, burdens. So it assumes there's something people want or don't want, and we have to figure out a way of distributing it. You know, you could do it by need, by desert, by luck, by sheer equality. So, you know, in the gene drive space, distributive justice might refer to the benefits and harms of gene drive research. What is the just allocation of risk in gene drive trials? You know, Carla mentioned environmental damage being a tip-top concern among people in communities that are affected by it. You know, how might we mitigate that risk is a question that's basically about distributive justice. Who stands to benefit? I think an important question here are different stakeholders' risks and benefits commensurate? We can identify different risks and benefits, and then as we're weighing them and distributing them, you know, these are just fundamentally different kinds of risks and benefits. I think, you know, that's zooming out a little bit. We can also ask about the sort of global distribution of scientific funding and technological development. So are we distributing this, you know, it's a less tangible, but it's nonetheless collective good in a just manner. You know, is each country or county getting what they are due in terms of the resources to create knowledge or to generate solutions to their problems? So I see this also as a matter of distributive justice that's sort of at a higher level than the community level, but nonetheless is really important. And then finally, you know, I'll use the words corrective, reparative, or restorative justice somewhat interchangeably here, but I think they're sort of all getting at the question, what is due to people who have been harmed or wronged in some way? So this kind of justice is invoked in conversations that center on what we do about historical injustices on a systemic or institutional scale, but it can also be used to mete out punishments or settlements in cases of interpersonal violence or wrongdoing. So in the gene drive space, reparative justice might be invoked by those who are designing decision-making procedures. You know, as Carla said already, like historically, in large part due to colonial dynamics, people in LMICs have been left out of decisions about the kinds of research that's done in their countries or the kinds of technologies that are delivered to their countries. And so you might think a commitment to reparative justice actually prioritizes their voice going forward, potentially in the gene drive space. And then, you know, similarly in thinking about investment, for example, in research on, preventing malaria or dengue, you know, most of the research funding in the globe is in, highly developed Western nations that have research infrastructures. And you might think that's an unjust allocation of that resource, and a commitment to reparative justice means, kind of correcting that in some way. And you might think that, the global investment in the gene drive space, put toward malaria and other insect-borne diseases is an act of reparative justice. So, I don't want to officially endorse any of these arguments, just to show that these different types of justice are invoked repeatedly in the debates about gene drives, sometimes simultaneously, but I think teasing them apart, or at least noticing when we're using them, is really helpful. I think I'll stop there, since I want to make sure we get everyone, and I have plenty of time to share my own thoughts, but I hope for now that helps us in our conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that primer, Carolyn. I think that's really helpful, and I think that we can touch back upon it throughout our conversation here today. We'll now turn over to Fred, and I should have said at the beginning that there's kind of a base level of knowledge that I think we're assuming in this session about the background technical understanding of gene drives, and I don't think, Fred, you need to necessarily go through all of that. I think we're looking to you more for the engagement between the scientific understanding of the work that's being done and these questions of justice and equity. So I turn it over to you now. Oh.
I'll join the conversation now. So I'll try to address some of those things, and it's really good to follow Carla and Carolyn. I'd like to also pick up on some of their points and their structures. Of course, I come to this as an evolutionary biologist who's been involved in gene drive research, as well as questions about its application. So I should say from the outset that I have been involved with the G-Bird group that is interested in eradicating rodents from islands where they're doing damage to biodiversity. I'm on that steering committee. And I'm also on the ethics committee of Target Malaria that's focused on Anopheles gambiae. So I want to comment from that perspective as well. In the sense, first to get to one point that Carla made, that these are diseases of the poor. And so this is about inequity to start with. And I've worked in Peru on dengue. And, you know, if people had good housing and running water, and they didn't store their water in containers, there'd be a lot less dengue. So I think we have to ask that a little, just be at least aware of this issue of, is this whole approach putting a Band-Aid on a problem when we talk about equity? So I think that's, Carla brought up a really important point. That doesn't mean that it can't be better than what came before it. And I would say, of course, we have been using insecticides for a long time for malaria and for dengue, and we're seeing that as a positive. It's, you know, you could do it in a comparative approach. Is this better or worse than these other approaches? In terms of the procedural justice, you know, that question of how do we actually get to these just outcome, you know, through a procedure, I would like to address just a little bit the question of how do you have oversight over one of these projects, either G-Bird or Target Malaria, in the sense of having an ethics committee that's oversight, or what is the best way? I don't want to go into, I may not get to go into that in a huge amount of detail, but I do want to bring that out, that it's important to figure out how you do these procedures. I am not an ethicist, so some of these terminology in the higher sense of things is a little bit foreign to me, so I'll try to keep on track with that. But I do want to also get into the biology. You know, I don't want to go over what is gene drive, but I do want to comment on the fact that when people talk about gene drive, and especially in the case of malaria, right? I can't remember if it was Carla or Carolyn brought up that, you know, one of the issues that people think about right away is that you're going to cause extinction of a species. And so you have to ask, you know, like, how is that going to impact the ecology? And, you know, is that detrimental? And I think that most of the people listening here recognize that how many thousands of mosquitoes there are, and that the whole idea of gene drive is to target a single grouping of mosquitoes that interbreed. And the question is, how much of an ecological disturbance would be important in terms of thinking through, is this justified? And of course, that's going to depend on where you are. If you're a conservationist in the UK, you may have a different perspective than somebody who's living in a country where there's a high malaria burden. So I just bring that up. And I just want to translate that to the G-Bird project in terms of mice and rats. You know, one thing that's of deep concern is that a gene drive that you use on an island to conserve biodiversity gets off that island and then causes suppression or extinction of a rodent species in its natural habitat. So there too, there is some kind of a difference among people. If you talk to poor people in New York City who have rat-infested houses, they have a different perspective on what would be just, I would assume. So I don't know the answers to these things, but I think the getting down to the detail of who it matters to is important for us to address. And another thing that has come up is the issue of where do you stop when you think about the ecological impacts? And this is a very thorny topic, but you have to ask issues about what's going to happen to behavior of humans with or without these kind of tactics. You know, what's going to be the longer term impacts of these things on people flourishing? And sometimes we try to stay away from that, but I think it is in that bigger context of the issue of poverty. So I want to get to one technical issue, and that is when people are really concerned about mice going to extinction or a mosquito going to extinction. The focus when everybody talks about gene drive is this sort of force where once you release a few insects or mammals, that spread is going to be continuous throughout the range of that species. And so that you could cause extinction of an entire species. So that's actually one kind of gene drive, but there are many types of gene drive. But that's the one that people think of right away. But the other types of gene drive are ones that are either spatially or temporally confined. So a gene drive that would only work on a specific island because it's targeted at the genomes of the species on that island. Or an approach with mosquitoes where you could target one city or one neighborhood, okay, compared to it moving throughout the species range. And so when you ask about justice versus the ecological impacts, certainly something that's spatially or temporally restricted may be seen as being more just because it's not going to spread everywhere, you can control it. But those kind of approaches have so far gained maybe more buy-in in a way that people who have funding can fund a program to eradicate mosquitoes in their neighborhood, right? So in certain sense, maybe the broad gene drive, which doesn't know rich from poor, could have a little bit more equity in the way it acts. So I guess I would just say that, there is that important piece of not a science-based, but a science-informed kind of approaches where we look carefully at the details of what's happening on the ground. I do want to touch just a little bit, and maybe this is just for conversation, about how do you attain in a specific program a just approach. And I think at this point, the idea of having ethics committees has been one that has been pointed out. But as being a member of one ethics committee, and I speak for myself, but I think with the entire ethics committee with target malaria, the question is how close do you get to the researchers, right? Because if you're not close enough, then you don't understand the details of what they're doing. But if you are too close, then you're bound to pick up on what their concerns are. So I'd just like maybe to throw that out for a little future discussion. And I'm glad to comment more on some of the technical aspects, but I'll leave that depending upon where the discussion goes. So thank you.
Fred, I think this is really helpful primer, again, on the more technical side, but I think you've done a lot to show, to give us all a picture of the interface between these ethical and moral conversations and the technical conversations that are going on. I really appreciate that. And I think this will be easily a focus for a broader conversation. So thank you. Anna Maria, I turn now to you for your thoughts as a bit of an outsider in this conversation.
So thank you for including me as an outsider in your conversation. So yes, I have most of my sort of work in the category of risky or socially controversial emerging technologies has been in regards to climate engineering. And so I will start out by saying, obviously there are very some obvious differences between the technical aspects of these different kinds of technological proposals. That being said, when I was rereading the National Academy's report from 2016, I was quite struck by the similarities in both the level and development of the debate on justice and equity issues, and also the different proposals that are sort of being worked through on how to implement these considerations in research.
Anna Maria, sorry, just to interrupt just for a second. I just wanted to ensure that people here might not know what you mean by climate engineering. So if you can give a one sentence overview of that, that would be helpful.
For sure. Climate engineering is refers to broadly, I guess, deliberate proposals for intervening in the environment to offset the effects of climate change. So that includes, for example, solar radiation management, so putting aerosols in the upper atmosphere to block out sunlight, which is a global method for basically reducing the temperature of the Earth, creating clouds in ocean areas where they don't exist, fertilizing the oceans with iron, for example, as a way of drawing down CO2 and so forth. So large-scale intentional interventions in the environment. So in that respect, I think there are some similarities with gene drives and what's being proposed. So yes, so I do think there are a lot of, I guess, the conversation is very similar in terms of the governance and how we work through these different proposals for how, including the need to and how to implement justice and equity considerations in real time with regards to these emerging technologies like gene drives. I obviously approach this from the perspective of the law and in particular international law. And so thank you to Carolyn for introducing these different conceptions of justice. And these are also represented in different legal arguments about how norms and mechanisms may apply to emerging technologies. And we also have these developed through jurisprudence and in different norms. So I think at this sort of general principle level, we do have conceptions of justice and also legal principles and mechanisms to some extent that incorporate notions of intergenerational equity, the idea of technology transfer and international cooperation and capacity building in scientific matters and so forth. And these are found in key instruments such as Convention on Biological Diversity and so forth. We also see an emerging conversation that I think is worth mentioning within legal spheres on the international human rights and how they might apply in these contexts. And one area that probably has not received enough attention, but is certainly receiving more discussion, at least within international law circles, is the so-called human right to science, which is codified in a number of international and regional human rights instruments, including, for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So Article 15(1)(b) codifies the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And so because these, this right has been neglected, we're now seeing interpretation elaboration of this right, which includes, I think, lots of the ideas of justice that we have discussed previously, the idea of a right to participate and be informed in decision-making processes, the linkage between substantive human rights, like the right to health, the right to food, and so forth, and the role in science and technology in advancing those rights. What struck me the most, however, is that that's sort of where we end in terms of the level of generalization. So we kind of hit it at a certain level where we can state the principles that apply and how they might be worked through and provide examples of issues that may arise. But the difficult aspect for me as a lawyer is how to design and implement practical processes for achieving just and equitable outcomes. And I think this is not particularly easy, and the devil's in the details. for example, ensuring that people have the right information, especially in a time of sort of a post-truth era, and giving them a right to be consulted is time-consuming. It's very expensive, and the question is always who pays. A lot of these technologies have transboundary or arguably global or intergenerational implications. And so the question is, who has an interest? Who has a right to be consulted? So is it the affected public? How do you do that in a transboundary context? Is it the interested public, which is broader? We have ideas, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity of biodiversity being the common concern of humankind. Is the whole world somehow interested in species and whether how we address them? So who should pay when things go wrong and people are harmed? So liability is something that is certainly a part of reparative justice. And if a scientist introduces a species as part of a test, and this has huge economic implications in a country, obviously restoring or correcting that wrong is not so easy, and not only in terms of like the ability to pay, but also whether compensation is really an adequate remedy at all. And also who has the jurisdiction and authority to implement these different kinds of processes for achieving just outcomes. And so none of these are necessarily clear. In certain areas, we may have some law to address these issues, but for the most part, I think these details need to be elaborated to a great extent. I think we also need to be attendant to the particular power dynamics that take place within research, who's driving it, both the agenda for the research, and also the policy that goes around it, surrounds it, and who's affected. So, so at least in the geoengineering debate, we've really seen the conversation start from Western or Northern countries, elite institutions, mostly white men, sort of driving the conversation. And it's taken a while for it to become more inclusive. It's still not particularly inclusive. And the way that conversation has sort of entered into, other jurisdictions, developing countries, I think there's some things to explore there, or some experiences that I'm happy to get into further to, which really sort of raises issues of whether an ad hoc means for stimulating conversation about justice and equity is really appropriate. So I think I'll end it there, but I'm happy to talk about more examples from geoengineering debate that maybe are helpful or instructive in the case of gene tribes.
I mean, Anna Maria, just to build on that for a second, and as we open it up to the other panelists as well, please raise your hand, panelists, as you want to make points related to this conversation. But in the climate engineering community right now, do you have a good example of attention to justice and equity concerns that's kind of happened in practice, or a bad example of like what an effort that was tried that really backfired?
Yeah, I mean, it's all sort of still happening. So I guess the outcomes are not assured at this point. So for a long time, I guess equity considerations were at that very like harms could occur in other places in the world. One country intervenes and harms are felt elsewhere. But there was very little, I think, specific discussion on, for example, the issues between developed and developing world, who's driving this agenda and so forth. And so this topic was introduced by a group of social scientists that held a conference and wrote a paper that appeared in Science or Nature, one of the two. And this sort of stimulated more sort of activities and conversation around equity and climate engineering. And that's obviously a good thing. It led to an initiative where a research body provided a modest amount of funding for developing country scientists to engage in mostly or exclusively modeling research on regional impacts from the, I guess, deployment of solar geoengineering technologies. So technologies to block out the sun. And these scientists were used existing data sets from modeling runs and work with sort of the top scientists from the north and from developed countries in sort of modeling impacts. I mean, there are a few things to think about here. The first is when you provide funding to look at impacts, you're already taking the technology as a given. And so you're developing a sort of constituency within that. And I think, you know, the top scientists who in the West who are working on these technologies are, to a certain extent, advocates of the technology itself and promote it in various ways as a potential solution. And so, so that's a sort of particular power dynamic that takes place. I mean, when we think about how research is done, it has a very entrepreneurial aspect. And I can say this as an academic myself. You know, you're on Twitter, you're promoting your ideas, you want people to cite your papers and so forth. And to a certain extent, that's what we want. We want to develop, you know, capacity to make decisions, including scientific capacity in developing countries, to facilitate global discussions on whether we should, you know, research, test, and even deploy these technologies. And this is, I think, a good faith effort, but I think
that's good. We can build on that, Anna Maria. We can build on that because I think, you know, turning back to some of Fred's comments earlier, you know, Fred, I think two of the things that you said, or well, many of the things that you said stuck with me, but two of the ones particularly relevant here, I think, are one, your point about as being part of on the ethics committee of Target Malaria. Like one of the things that Target Malaria has been trying to do is partner with local communities in Africa and local researchers as well, and try to do knowledge sharing and knowledge generation processes at the local level, where these potential applications are being envisioned. And it would be interesting for all of us to understand, you know, what kinds of conversations go on within the ethics committee about the structure of the program, not just the research, but the program and the organizational dynamics of something like Target Malaria. And I think that this also then turns to the conversation that I think all of us are pointing out, how in low and middle income countries in particular, but also in more developed countries, all of the problems that we're dealing with are, you know, one way to describe them is a wicked problem that you know, if you're talking about the problem of malaria, this is also a problem of, you know, diseases. It's also a problem of drinking water. It's a problem of economics, a problem of local governance, and a problem of colonialism, a problem of so many, you know, and depending on how you frame the issue, depending on how you address it. And And gene drive research is a specific technical option to address a particular framing of what some of these problems are that may not attend to all of those other ways of seeing these issues. But if you could build on that, and then I'm sure that Carolyn and Carla, you might also want to be coming in here too.
Okay, well, I'll try a little bit. And I would say that there are actually some other folks who are attendees who are from the committee, so they may want to comment. And our chair is with us as well. Indeed, we are not just interested in the research aspects guiding the research, but indeed that interface with the community. And that's where you have to know what the researchers are doing or what the outreach people are doing in order to comment on those kind of issues. And so, but as you speak with them, as we have a meeting of the ethics committee, how close should that ethics committee be to having people from the researchers involved in informing that committee, and how much do we get our information from outside? How do we give advice to that committee? We're not a committee that tells them what to do, but gives advice. How do we structure that? And I would just say that the committee's been in existence for quite a while, but we're still growing and learning how to do this. So I think these inputs in this kind of sphere are really important. And I really think it's being done in a way, I mean, since that National Academy report brought this out in a way to look at a technology. I'm sure the same thing with climate change and geoengineering, but that's a new thing to try to do that. This was not done when we had large malaria eradication programs using insecticides. Right, so I just want to bring that out, but there definitely is that importance for the interface. I hope I'm getting things started here in the way you want. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there something else you wanted me to comment on?
Well, no. I mean, I think there's lots of ways that we can talk about the structure of the committee itself and relate it to different ways of understanding at what point and through which mechanisms do we attend to questions of justice and equity? And I think all of us have pointed out the importance of reflecting on that. I think just talking about ethics committees, I think would do a disservice to the richness of venues where these kinds of conversations can be had. And Carla, and I think in a moment, Carolyn, I can ask you all for your thoughts on particular other venues for that. But I'll just say one, in my research, engaged with the Mice Against Ticks project, where there's a real question on how to, there's been lots of engagement with local communities on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and that engagement, oscillates between things like town halls, local conversations, but also through the boards of health. And the idea that, the boards of health form a kind of subsidiary space that make decisions on behalf of communities. And through that, decisions and conversations get framed in particular ways. There's also, conversations, I don't know the current state of these conversations on, establishing a data science management board, which is a concept taken very much from clinical research, but as a way of creating an ability to oversee not just judicial and equity concerns, but also other types of general ethical concerns. And these kinds of bodies, I think, in part are addressed in a way to get around one of the issues that Fred brought up, which is this question of how do you get information into these bodies, and in order to have a debate around what's going on the ground. I think having a capacity to independently receive information and data apart from the researchers is an important way of creating what I will call in my research speak epistemic justice, but a way of ensuring that there are many different ways that people can say what is and what exists in the world. Carolyn, I'm going to jump to you and then to Carla, maybe to also discuss other ways that we practically can talk about and make decisions on justice and equity issues.
Sure. Your comment about different framings really resonated with me, because I think that that's a really important piece of this, that the way that you frame a problem and sort of put a scope around it will very much identify the sort of available options that that then fall out of that, or the available ways forward. And I think it's really important. One thing that I think we're getting at by naming different, committee structures and institutional structures to have these conversations is the importance of having a variety of them, because it's not, it's probably a good thing that committees have remits, right? That they have particular things to look at, and that defines their scope and potentially the framings, and that that might help in a very practical way, sort of just orient people on the committee to their task. Make sure that the work can happen in the half an hour or the hour that's allotted to the committee every quarter. These are practical constraints on what people can achieve. But I think it just points to the need for lots of different kinds of forums in which, one can frame questions and explore, the options, or what follows from that. My own work has sort of toggled between thinking about the community level engagement with sort of, directly affected persons, I'll leave it at that it's quite narrowly framed, versus, thinking about how to create forums for broad public deliberation that's like extremely open, right? Instead of creating a forum about gene drives, it might say, wow, malaria is a really big deal, and we need to think about lots of different ways forward. How should we be allocating resources in the malaria space without sort of putting the cart before the horse and having a forum about gene drives? And that might not even be the biggest framing. It might be, what are the sort of the priorities of lower and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and how can the global science community, rally around what people are identifying there? So that would be an even bigger framing. And so, I think I'm sort of generating a picture of like really openness and advocating for lots of different forums in which we can invite lots of different framings, but also, these forums don't exist. And I think this is where Anna Maria can be really helpful in just sort of pointing out in some cases, where the legal mechanisms that already exist to sort of create these might bump up against, the sort of ethical vision for, a global observatory or deliberative forum, however justified and necessary we may think that is.
Thank you. Carla?
Yes, so just elaborating on what Carolyn said, I think, and I'm just gonna go, broad to the other extreme. I think that what we need now from the perspective of the global research ethics governance agenda is we need to think about an appropriate research ethics system that is not narrowly focused on research with human subjects, that is not and that also opens up, creates a space and distributes roles and duties between in a broad way, like Carolyn was saying, including spaces for more open discussions. This is not just relevant for gene drive. I'm thinking about, what comes with like CRISPR and gene editing, the human genome editing. I think that, from PAHO's perspective, we've been saying for already several years that we need to, this research ethics committee approach to research ethics governance is not working. We need to start thinking in terms of research ethics systems. And COVID has really shaken our world and has also made it clear that also research ethics committees within that system need a louder voice. We need more dialogue. We need to foster collaboration. We need to go, we need just to think a way of making, of having a more dynamic relationship between the members, between the components of a research ethics system, and I think, and this is like also a minor piece of information, but I think it's really relevant for the discussion. We're talking about engaging the public and who's the source of information. Many of you have pointed out that if the conversation may be problematic if the source of information is the one that has a vested interest in conducting his or her own project, even if it's completely legitimate and justified. And one problem in many LMICs, I'm talking specifically from a perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, is that scientific journalism is a discipline that's almost non-existent. Okay, we've seen this has been a real serious issue with COVID, and we don't have voices or other voices out there informing the public. That makes the conversation, if you think about a conversation about this in the US, that's very different from this same conversation in another setting, in another language, where other important voices are missing. So so that's pretty much what I was thinking. I'm thinking that if you think about the trajectory of research ethics governance, we started with a very small subset of research with human subjects, which is biomedical research, clinical trials, so with therapeutics and devices, and we've been expanding the scope. And I think we have to be more deliberate in continuing that trajectory, in thinking what types of structures we should implement as part of that exercise.
Carolyn, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask Carla specifically. So I think that your description of the sort of like need for research ethics systems and infrastructure, right, historically makes sense, right? That trajectory makes a lot of sense. But I think in this space, right, we also have a lot of, there's a long history and trajectory that we could draw on from just like non-research activities that affect the environment. So, you know, like where we build power plants, environmental degradation, pouring paint into communal, you know, sources of water. In the panel, in the chat, we see, you know, just decisions to spray indiscriminately. These are not cashed out as research activities, and so don't have it historically activated sort of research ethics governance system. And so one question I just sort of grapple with is how helpful or useful is it to sort of just like bring in the research ethics machinery when, you know, a lot, you know, the channels that actually, to me, this mirrors more is just sort of like environmental governance and oversight in institutions. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You know, I don't think we have to pick an either or, but I think we can't really tell that story without also sort of understanding this trajectory. So I just wondered what your thoughts there were.
Go ahead, Carla. You can respond to that, and then I'll take the conversation, I think, in another direction too.
What you said made a lot of sense to me, Carolyn. But my only concern is that those bodies, those entities, the strength, that expertise, those institutions are often missing in many low and middle income countries. So if they were there, it'd be easier to do that partnership. But that's not always the case for something as simple as use of animals in laboratory research. In Latin America and the Caribbean, that's, you know, there's really not much there. You have like those top salient institutions that adhere to international standards, but for the rest, it's something. It's really a puzzle, and so I think that's. It's great, except that we don't. It's great to do that, except that we don't have that little piece or big piece, I would say. And so we need to build that too. And my worry, and kind of like reflecting from some research ethics lessons in the region, is that we have seen that when certain types of research have been perceived as scary, oh, we may not have the capacity to deal with that. We freak out. Research with pregnant women, oh my God, that sounds horrible, scary. What we have done in many countries in the region is to opt for a regulatory path to forbid them altogether. Forbid research with children, forbid research with pregnant women. So I think that my goal would be to continue having this conversation, engaging others and to make sure we choose the wiser path, as opposed to just freaking out and opting for a regulatory strategy, just forbid things altogether, because we forbid the potential of improving equity and health of our populations.
Those are wonderful. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I think Fred wants to jump in on it as well. So let's keep it going.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think it's making me more aware. These are not we talk about the word research ethics committee has taken over, and the committee that Target Malaria has and the one that's being envisioned by G-Bird are not research ethics committees. And I think it answers to some of your question that we do need to be much broader than just a research ethics committee. We have to be a program ethics committee, right? To look at it much more broadly. And I think the comment was made by one of the members of our committee that, we have been in Ghana, we've tried to connect to what's going on and the epistemological issue of, where do we get our information about how the program is going and how people in these countries are responding to it. Where does that come from? So I think that broadening out that you're mentioning is really important. I think maybe we're on the road there, but the emphasis that you're bringing out is very important.
Well, and I think another point that is really being brought up here is that I think a lot of people don't see that the development of gene drives is also the development of the governance system around gene drives. So like the technical process of developing is being created at the same time that we're building the spaces and procedures and methods to assess whether it's good and safe and desirable and which applications we want and the like. And we have questions at each of these moments of decision making around this development to say, well, how do we want to think about what a gene drive is and what it attends to, and whether or not like committee X is okay, whether or not it's the Board of Health or the Research Ethics Committee, or like, whether these bodies or these types of bodies are appropriate to address gene drive issues, or whether we need to create some kind of totally new forum for coming to decisions around, should we deploy or should we even invest in research and gene drive, technology X or Y. And I think these questions are really coming to a fore in the conversation that we just had, where you have settings where, and on one hand, you have some settings like Carolyn was mentioning, where there are already several venues where these kinds of conversations can come up and be addressed. And so the need to create a new venue specifically to have this kind of conversation might not be necessary. We might be able to make use of existing ones like a Board of Health or something like that. Whereas in other settings, particularly in low middle income countries, the kind of governance infrastructure more broadly isn't as robust or as developed. And so there's a question of, do we use gene drives as a method to create a governance system that then could be also redeployed for other purposes and other technical areas. Let's say the gene drive governance process then is deployed for water resource management, and in the next phase, how does that propagation of governing capabilities, relate to the propagation of the gene drive organism itself? There's an organizational and judicial propagation as well as the technical propagation. But I see Anna Maria wants to jump in here too. So mix it up a little, Anna Maria.
Well, I was just going to add that Carolyn, I think, was right to point out that it's partly useful to situate this within the field of environmental law and governance. But there again, we see an issue, especially in regulating research, where there aren't really mechanisms for linking, for example, intervention style research, field testing. There aren't really, I guess, best practices and mechanisms for governing that or regulating that, even in Canada. So for example, federal funding is partly linked to our impact assessment laws, but those laws may not be fit for purpose for the particular issues related to gene drive. So for example, you have big questions around uncertainty. Is the precautionary principle embedded in those assessment frameworks? You also have issues of thresholds of risk. And so often small scale experiments fall below those thresholds that would trigger existing laws and regulations. And so again, when we really look at the existing laws and mechanisms, they often fall short, even in countries like Canada and the US. And I think that's fairly clear in the reports as well.
Yeah. Fred, did you want to jump in on this, or were you still unmuted from before?
I'm sorry. No, not to jump in.
Okay. All right. And Carolyn, did you want to comment? No? Okay. So I've got yes, Carla. I'm trying to read everybody's videos.
Sorry. I should be more
expressive.
Okay. So I just want to, go back to the idea that it's like about certain bodies being fit to purpose. And I think it's very important we insist with like ethics committee, with governance entities, it's not one size fits all. It's not like we have this and let's just like repurpose this for 30 other things. And just for example, one issue that we've been dealing with in Latin America and the Caribbean, fighting this perception that an ethics committee of review of research with human subjects can be the body that handles every aspect of ethics. I mean, we've seen attempts to task those committees with priority setting decisions for COVID treatment during the pandemic. We've seen attempts to just enhance their role and make them also committees that review environment research and animal research. And by the way, using the Declaration of Helsinki and informed consent as the appropriate tools, which I still don't know what would that mean in case of research with animals or research with the environment, right? And this is something that, I mean, I was saying earlier, we ought to do better. We ought to do a better ethics analysis, but in terms of procedure and how decisions are made, we need to also be able to think what the best outlets are for the ethics assessment of what is at stake. And it's a related issue we have seen, and WHO has responded to it. We've seen that public health surveillance is being treated as research because no knowledge of a better framework. So let's just act as if public health intervention, public health surveillance would be research with human subjects. So we already have a lot of these and find the best way to do them.
Yeah. Well, and I think as well, like your kind of characterization of, in a way, or I can rephrase that as kind of ethics committees as hammers, and then everything kind of turns into a nail. This is what I'm talking about. As we think about, what are appropriate ways to practically engage with questions of justice and equity and gene drives, that we are in a way talking about maybe creating something that could in the future have the power of an ethics committee, or in another field of work that I'm heavily involved in, as a biosafety committee. Like biosafety committees are routinely brought in to consider concerns about security and other things that really stretch the bounds of their like epistemic jurisdiction, and that can be problematic, but it also at least gives us a place to have those kinds of conversations. So there's this continual tug and pull between our ability to at least be able to talk and have a voice, and for others to have a voice, and for it to be somehow in some way a sense of an idealized form of what a good forum might look like. I'm going to leave that there because Fred and Carolyn both want to make points, and I'm recognizing. I just want to say for our audience, I'm recognizing that there's quite a stream of comments in the chat now that we will be pulling in and getting to as we transition to this open Q&A period. And if you have more thoughts, please do put them into the chat too. So Fred first, and then Carolyn, and then I'll turn.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to this issue of you don't have that avenue of informed consent like you would have in some kind of public health interventions. And that is a big deal. And Sam, you brought up that thing of wicked problems. I mean, to me, you know, like you could do all of the procedural kinds of things. And at some point, you survey the communities, you interact, you engage with them, and you're not going to have a consensus. And I guess one of the real wicked problems here is how do you move forward when there is no consensus? And I have no answer to that, but I do think it's something we have to struggle with. But just what you're saying, though, is that once you move away from this nicely described idea of an ethics committee, you have to reinvent what that is and come up with ways of improving that and basically reinventing it. So thank you.
Carolyn?
Yeah, so this conversation is making me feel more agnostic probably about the sort of committee structure and exactly what we call them, and a little bit of the let a thousand flowers bloom, try things out, see what works. But I think my worry really comes down to importing principles and sort of ethical and moral commitments from research ethics, which historically have deprioritized, if not ignored, justice, and instead looking to other areas of practice like environmental justice and law, and of which I know much less about. So I'm a little bit out of my league, but at least my limited knowledge says that an environmental justice movement, right, looking to sort of like that as, okay, how can we have some transformation here, new social structures, new forms of organizing that actually empower other communities in the wake of historical injustice. It just might be a sort of richer place conceptually to think about the meaning of justice and what it requires and the different kinds of institutions that are possible. Again, my concern in the bioethics space is that relying on committee structures and other kinds of structures that are coming from a tradition that historically has not prioritized justice might not serve us very well here.
Yeah, well, so I think, thank you, Carolyn. Sorry, did I cut you off? Or? Okay, so I think that this really nicely dovetails, Anna Maria, so I'm going to turn to you because, but just after I say it, this really nicely dovetails with the set of comments that are coming in to us via the chat from our attendees. And I might just bring out two of them and turn to Anna Maria for thoughts that she was going to say and see if we can incorporate these as well, because it seems like, Abanos Faxon has made several comments for us around basically that we're talking here about creative ways of approaching ethics, and that it's not just a one-size-fit-all kind of effort, but what are these other kinds of activities? Different ethics committees for different issues, or like what are some other examples that we might want to be building on for how to constructively promote attention to justice and equity issues. Carolyn, I think you were getting at that with the turn towards maybe what the environmental justice movement is going. And this dovetails with another point that is coming up, it seems to be in the chat in several different ways, which is the capacity building for having these kinds of conversations and making these kinds of decisions and incorporating those decisions, feeding those decisions back into research trajectories seems to be a big issue that we are we're bringing up several times and in several ways. And it might be interesting to see how each of you think of the capacity strengthening efforts that are currently going on, either in gene drives or certainly, Anna Maria, for you in other technical areas as well. And what does that look like in particular, maybe Carla, for low and middle income countries? Like, how do we create this stronger capacity for attending to questions of justice and equity? But Anna Maria, I'm going to turn to you first, and then whomever else wants to chime in too.
Yes, I guess sort of picking up on Carolyn's comment, I think there is a very sort of anthropocentric focus to our conversation thus far. And I think it's worth pointing out that sort of within the environmental justice debate, there are, important questions being posed and discussions surrounding rights for nature, and you know, one of the rights we might contemplate is the right to not be intervened in various ways. And I think we've sort of taken it as a given that we're sort of just balancing out the rights amongst different people and trying to manage harms to the environment. But I think it's worth noting that there's an increasing and more robust debate around you know, our relationship to nature, and you know, what is ethical with regards to human and non-human interactions. What is their agency that we can accord to nature rights and so forth. And I think, you know, that's an important piece in this conversation. It doesn't, the problem is, as soon as you get into like human health and agriculture and human rights, you've kind of already, although there's this idea of the right to a healthy environment, you've sort of framed it already in like excluding any sort of voice or rights for nature within that conversation. So I think that's another sort of area of the literature to look at.
That's fascinating, and it really shows that the really high level institutional framing that goes on, that allows and limits our particular ways to see and therefore address particular forms of justice and inequity. Do others want to come in here on you know, efforts that you see that are going on that are testing the other forms of traditional models of attending to justice and inequity concerns?
I suspected that wasn't probably at least in geoengineering, that's not the most popular point within the research community. But well, there is a big debate, especially in geoengineering, at least around the justice issues for nature, not just for humans.
Yeah, well, and with these issues as well, you know, there has been you know, a conversation between the gene drive researcher community and the conservation research community. I don't know if any of you have been directly involved in those conversations. I'm sure there are people on the line who have been. I think, Fred, you've been in some of these conversations, but you know, where there's the tension too, on the one hand, that, you know, the preservation of species and ecosystems, and on the other hand, the modification of them, you know, in order to preserve them. So there's this reconfiguration. It goes back to the previous forum discussion on natural versus synthetic, you know, on what it is that we're trying to what it is that we're trying to help and trying to and what we think is out of order and in need of rectifying in some form.
Yeah, I would just say these are really difficult conversations. It's not quite as simple as when you're dealing with humans and you say health. Well, that's a, you know, flourishing. We have some sense of that. It's very different when we're talking about people's relationship to nature. And yeah, I do think there are people on this, the attendees, who could comment on that as well.
Carla.
Just a brief comment in that regard. I think that there's a huge worry in low and middle income countries about gene drive being posing an ecological threat, and I don't think we have we have sufficiently shared the. I mean, we're having mostly the health discussion, but gene drive can also be a tool to promote biodiversity. And I think that opens up another side of the conversation that adds a layer of complexity that I think is really important. It doesn't get put in the box of the bad things. We don't want to talk about that. That makes it acceptable. I mean, that has a potential that if you're concerned with protecting biodiversity, that you cannot just simply ignore. But I wanted to go back, Sam, to what you were asking a moment ago about a strengthened capacity and what capacity needs to be strengthened. And I think that we deal with a major trust issue. And this is, we've said this a million times, this is not traditional research ethics topic. We know research ethics, it's not about research ethics with ethics of research with human subjects, but the ethics of research is at stake. And so this trust in research is really important, and our baseline is bad. There's very little trust in research in LMICs. And I think that we have to think about strengthening research capacity, because this gene drive technology, like other technologies, get seen as those things that people from the north bring to us, completely foreign, that we cannot relate to, and are the subject of mistrust. And we also need to strengthen capacities to improve research ethics governance and to improve ethics governance of public health interventions, of interventions aimed at protecting the environment. And as I said, there's this trajectory. We know where we started with a very small subset of biomedical research, but for many jurisdictions, the conversation about many of these other types of ethical issues that have to do with health, with the environment, it's still a very foreign discussion. And I work closely with the majority of ministers of health in the region, and many of these tools, many of these governance structures are really foreign. And we, as I was saying a moment ago, I just think that we have to do some work to make sure that we in some countries don't opt for, that we give genuine consideration to these strategies and do the proper analysis on a case-by-case basis to see what are the potential benefits, what are the risks, and pack all the risks, see how those can be minimized or how mitigated, and we just do the proper work instead of just like blocking everything that can have the potential of improving health and inequity.
I think you're really bringing up some really important points about trust in research, trust in science, that exists generally within these societies, but I think it's something that we're getting a taste of more, and certainly in American society, with in the last 10 or 20 years, but it's really shown its face, I think, in the last year with the pandemic as well. These different information spheres that lead to different understandings of the relationship between scientific research and political governance, and therefore different understandings of the value and importance of science to addressing the types of concerns that large swaths of the publics see as needing to be addressed. And Maria, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, I think, and maybe I'm being ambitious here, but I think a lot of countries have signed on to these major agreements, human rights agreements, that guarantee some notion of human rights to science. And I think the next step would really be to implement at the national level strategies, action plans, and structures for mediating the societal conversation, considering the risks, enabling public, broader, expert and non-expert participation in these conversations. And I do think human rights is a good vehicle for starting to develop more governance, not just in these particular areas as sort of one-off ad hoc mechanisms, but start to think about a more generalized system for mediating societal conversations about the role of science and technology generally. And I do think, you know, this conversation has started within the human rights community. It has and could be potentially a useful vehicle for implementing processes, not just for gene drives, but all the other things that seem to be occurring. And also international conversations as well, because aspects of this right also deal with that international cooperation aspect of science and technology.
I mean, I think this is you know, it's interesting, Anna Maria, that you turn towards the you know, the nation state as the entity to which, you know, we might want to turn in these kinds of moments for organizing and guidance and structure.
Well, I do international law. I guess like you need kind of footholds, and so, you know, countries already have obligations, and however they organize the implementation of that obligation, obviously within human rights, there's a huge margin of appreciation or discretion with regards to how that conversation or how that would be implemented domestically. And so I think you would see all manner of systems within different countries of how that look, and tailored to culturally appropriate and socially appropriate demands. But
right.
And not to say there aren't all sorts of shortcomings from.
I mean, there are.
No.
Yeah. Well, and in addition, the question of having, you know, national conversations immediately raises the question of transboundary issues that arise from these kinds of technological developments, whether we're talking climate engineering or gene drives, and I just want to point out that, you know, alternatives to nation states being, you know, the locus of engagement, either through, you know, their own nation state work or through the, you know, Convention on Biological Diversity or you know, other UN methods of conversation. You know, a lot of the work a lot of the research that's going on in this space right now is being funded by private means or by, you know, military means as well. But the private funding and structure allows an alacrity in research design and an ability to create forums for conversation and debate and discussion that can be in addition to formal government kind of efforts, that can be you know, to go around, you know, blockages that might be happening within, you know, official government spaces, or can be used as a method to generate those formal government systems of oversight and engagement as well. And I think all of those are actually happening within the gene drive research communities in different places around the world right now.
Yeah. I guess I like not to propose some sort of hegemonic plan for the world, but I do think, you know, that is one piece. Obviously there, you know, and I do think governments have a role and actually responsibility to facilitate and mediate these discussions between different private actors and stakeholders, and also between countries. And so there are, I guess, to point out that there are existing structures within the law, for example, human rights, but also when we talk about transboundary physical harm, significant physical harm to the environment, or the risk of physical harm, there are, for example, duties to consult in those situations. The problem is really when you work through the law, you find all the loopholes in those mechanisms. But, you know, we do have some structures that can be developed. And I do think there is a role for governments, not only with respect to gene drives, but with regards to science and technology more generally. And more needs to be done by governments to structure this societal conversation?
No, I think it's really great, because I think one thing that this conversation is generally pulling out is that, you know, there's a conversation on the technical side about, you know, there is a problem in the world, and we need to try and fix, you know, the current systems of dealing with malaria, or, you know, Lyme disease, or you know, feral cats, or whatever is not working. You know, we need something else. So here's an option of something else. And that then gets immediately coupled with, yes, but our existing ways of assessing like whether this is good or not are not adequate. So we need something else. And there's this like drive to be trying to figure out, well, what are our new forms of governing the conversation around, is this a good idea or not? I think is, you know, I think our conversation is really pulling out that there's some experimentation going on with those kinds of ways of incorporating ethics and equity and justice concerns, and that those forms of experimentation are just as important as the technical work of developing potential gene drive applications and figuring out whether they work or not. Because the conversation that ultimately the determinations about whether they work or not are going to be ones that go through these bodies of oversight and assessment that will have either been set up or redeployed from other areas to make sense of what is and isn't being done in gene drives. I'm going to turn to Fred, and I also recognize that there's another question that we haven't been getting to around well, I'll turn to Fred. I'll let you say your piece, Fred, and then we'll open it up to this other question that I think is important.
I just wanted to ask Carla to comment because as a representative of PAHO, right, she's coming from hearing from different countries at that level. And, you know, you mentioned earlier that PAHO is very different from WHO. And I just was wondering about what the conversations are like that you would be having, you know, in those countries. I mean, you know, what would they be telling us? You know, what would the representatives from those countries be telling us in the way that they would want this thing run?
Thanks. I don't think we're that different, but one thing that is peculiar, I mean, PAHO was established many years before United Nations and WHO as a Pan-American public health organization. And we've had a regional bioethics program since 1993 and have a specific mandate from our member states to work on bioethics. And I'm the only person, I mean, I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I'm the only person coming from LMICs in this discussion. And one thing that is really notorious to me is that many of these entities, these structures that we're talking about are generally foreign. I mean, they can be sort of like be implemented in some countries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're part of their machinery. And I think we have to be sensitive that yes, we want to address an inequity with these technologies, but we are the baseline inequity is not only a health inequity caused by where vector-borne diseases are located, but there's also inequity based on our capacities, our research ethics, governance capacities, our governance capacities in general. And I think we're doing a progress. We work closely with member states on these issues. And but I think we need to do a lot more. I'm just going to say one thing in response to, I mean, Ana Maria's comment about law and human rights frameworks. We also have to grapple with the fact that, especially in Latin America, we're legally generous, as it were, in that we come up quickly with laws for everything. And that doesn't mean that we have and on paper, some things may look great. That doesn't mean that we actually have the capacity to implement those. And the law is for the most just a bedrock. And on top of that, I mean, X is unacceptable, but the broad scope of analysis of what is ethically right, what's the appropriate way of treat people, how do we conduct an actual risk assessment of a proposed gene drive intervention, that requires a set of capacities, and how to even we embark on that discussion, because we need to have some trust to just even want to take that path. So one final thing that I want to say is that that risk assessment that has to be robust and transparent also has to take into account the risk of doing nothing, the risk, as I mean, there's someone who's been, Diane Ray Cahan has been pointing that out in the chat, that we have to assess the risk. I mean, but compared to what? What's the reality? What's the alternative? And take into account what I would call the moral cost of opportunity that is at stake when we're assessing these interventions. That, you know, we have to take into account that not doing anything or that has also a cost in terms of like health and well-being of populations.
Anna Maria, you wanted to build on that, or?
I mean, in suggesting, I guess all I was meant to suggest is that I think it's worth thinking about that we need to start developing national or domestic structures generally for addressing science and technology and mediating those conversations in society. And certainly laws on the books is not at all sort of what I had in mind. These are obviously, you need a sort of, you know, strategies, action plans, objectives, processes, and I'm also not intending to suggest that that is easy. Certainly there's this idea within, for example, if you look within the field of human rights, this idea of progressive implementation of these certain rights. But I think, you know, this is one vehicle for thinking about, you know, what comes next. And I think the gene drive conversation isn't necessarily unique. And I think points the need, you know, we have all these examples now of where we're grappling with the implications of technologies both within domestically and their transboundary or international global impacts. And so I think, you know, it's worth thinking about sort of general structures within countries and between countries for mediating these conversations. But I didn't mean to suggest that this is easy or trite or that it excludes other, you know, obviously this is one piece of a very complex puzzle, but I think it's worth considering.
Yeah, well, you know, so we have just over 5 minutes or so left for our conversation, and one of the questions that has come up in several different ways in the chat, I think, is around it's building on Carla's last point, I think, which is this ability to talk about not only what happens and who pays when something goes wrong, but also what do we do about the options that were not pursued. I think this gets to the restorative justice kinds of points that Carolyn was outlining at the beginning. This question of, you know, if we're not going to say that a decision is made in one way or another to not deploy a gene drive application in a particular region to deal with a particular issue, should there be a kind of cost of making that decision to not deploy, of making that decision, and this is tied up obviously with a sense that there are very promissory discourses about potential benefits that it can accrue from a deployment, and the idea that those benefits would not accrue, let alone the complexities of the unintended consequences and the like. But it's a question that's come up in several different ways, so I wanted to give the panel an opportunity to address it. Who wants to take that on?
Maybe I could just clarify the question, which is, so you're saying, should we have some sort of obligation also to provide benefits, not only consider or costs of?
Well, I think that one way to read it, it could be, you know, it could be something in the lines of, we have, you know, let's look 20 years down the road, maybe one option for a future that we could exist in at that point is that there have been several applications of gene drive technologies that have addressed problems in certain areas of the world, but not in others, and that maybe decisions about not turning to particular areas of the world we're very much kind of, we're not going to do it here, we're going to do it here. Like, should there be a sense of restorative justice, if I'm using my terminology correctly, Carolyn, to attend to those kinds of potential paths that were not pursued. And the twist that I put on that is that my understanding of kind of reparative or restorative justice is often something that's done now to address issues that happened in the past, but it can also be something that's done now to address potential issues in the future, or to address decisions that are being made in the present. Anna Maria, in your world, I might think of like carbon offset conversations here, but Carolyn?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with it being used in that way. Another term that might be helpful is like intergenerational justice there. I mean, sort of like what are obligations to future generations? And so you might think, if we're projecting 20 to 50 years down the line, the morbidity and mortality from malaria, let's say, continues apace or gets worse, right? Because of climate change and the expanding region where mosquitoes can live as predicted. That's something that we really need to take seriously, both like backward looking and I think forward looking, sort of, if we anticipate that this problem is going to get even worse than it already is, then that might justify assuming, present generations assuming more risk than perhaps we're comfortable with, because we anticipate that the exacerbation of this issue. So I think that there's conceptual machinery to help us understand that. I think there's always a cost, right? You make one decision, there's always an opportunity cost. To me, doing nothing is an action, right? Like that's a very intentional decision to not pursue a technology. It's not doing nothing. But there's also a cost to doing this, right? And I think, do we think of this as a zero-sum game? We can only do gene drives or malaria vaccine research, or bed net distribution, or strengthening water management systems, or housing. To me, I think the sad thing is, in reality, we probably do have to choose. There isn't an infinite amount of resources to invest in these different things, or at least there isn't a political will among the actors who could pay for a variety of things to do so. They're really just interested in one of those things. That's unfortunate from a justice perspective, because again, when you're thinking about this more broadly, it's sort of like, well, why are we only talking about this technology when there actually are lots of other measures on the table to alleviate this problem? So, I think it kind of comes down to a practical constraint, right? Like, are we constrained in having to choose one or the other, or can we? Is there enough investment in political will to take a multi-pronged strategy, which is, probably, this is of the scale that it seems to require one.
This attention to practical constraint jumps back to the wicked problems issue, and the idea that practical constraint is there because we don't think that we can move the political structures that constrain our ability to have particular conversations and not others. I am cognizant that we are at our time now, which is amazing, because I think that this conversation has really flown. I think that there have been wonderful additions to our conversation that we haven't been able to get to in the chat interface. I will just note one very briefly, which was Lori Zoloff had noticed that they're currently spraying for West Nile virus, outside of her house, for mosquito sprays, and they've had much less say in whether or not that happens than in a lot of the local community conversations that are happening around the target malaria group right now, as one example. So like the fact that we're having a lot of these conversations around a specific technological area of gene drives doesn't mean that, it's a point to reflect on, I think, more generally, and maybe a point to just to lightly leave the conversation that we're having now and turn over to Karen Tudis for a general wrap up. And to do that, I will just say thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think this has been a very energetic conversation, and I hope that it sparked a lot more conversations, because as I said at the beginning, this is one forum for us to have these kinds of conversations, but it cannot be the place where these conversations stop, and they have to continue on in many other ways and in many other places with many other actors in order for them to have meaningful impact on our society and our path forwards. Or I think actually, Rafiq, I'm handing it back to you now.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Evans. And much appreciate you hosting and facilitating today's discussion. Like you said, I wish we had more time to kind of continue such a provocative, engaging, and interesting discussion. Yeah, it's definitely showed us different perspectives and has left a lot to consider here. Also want to thank our panelists, Fred, Anna Maria, Carolyn, and Carla, for generously sharing their time, views, and opinions. And I also want to take the time to thank everyone from around the globe who's kind of taken the time out of their busy schedules and joining us today. I'll touch on our next session. So the next session in the series is titled, Who Owns What to Whom? What is the nature and scope of responsibilities of the various actors? And this session is scheduled for September 14th at same time, so that's 10 a.m. Eastern US. And this one will be moderated by Dr. Jim Lavery of Emory University. And before I close the session, I'd just like to encourage everyone who's in attendance to share these webinars with your colleagues, with your circle, with your friends, so we can have an even more engaged conversation on the unsettled ethical issues in gene drive research. So yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone back here again next month. And then till then, I wish everybody all the best. Thank you and be well.
Thank you, everybody.